Uh, the world changed suddenly on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign nation born after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1992, when the people of Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, voted to gain their independence, and the Russian Federation accepted that decision. In the last 30 years, Ukraine has looked both east to Russia and west to Europe. Once a thoroughly corrupt society, Ukraine has in the last decade or so evolved into a liberal democracy with increasing aspirations to join both NATO and the European Union. It became a modern society integrated in both socioeconomic and mercantile ways with its European neighbors. The Russian dictator, President Vladimir Putin, raged against Ukraine's growing Western connections, especially the possibility, acknowledged by NATO but never acted upon, that it might one day join NATO. While Russia under Putin became a near clone of communist Russia in the Soviet Union, Ukraine moved the other way. After a decade-long effort to modernize the Russian military, Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine with some 150,000 plus troops. Ukrainians were and are utterly determined to defend their sovereignty and are fighting back stubbornly. The war has been a disaster for Ukraine. Thousands have been killed, and many of its cities have been completely leveled by indiscriminate Russian bombing. Putin's war broke the long peace in Europe, beginning in 1945, a peace marred only by the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, wars that, although very bloody, involving instances of ethnic and religious genocide, were limited in scope by the fact that no major power was involved. But Putin's war on Ukraine was fought by the Russians with great brutality, and is fought by the Russians, and war crimes, I think, plain for all of us to see, committed against civilians with the leveling by air attacks and artillery of large tracts of major Ukrainian cities. By attacking Ukraine with a massive force, Putin provoked NATO and much of the rest of the world to withdraw from Russia, for major oil companies such as Shell and ExxonMobil, to hamburger giant McDonald's, to coffee giant Starbucks, to virtually all major credit cards. The West began a near global boycott of Russia. Vladimir Putin threatened a nuclear response, hinted at the use of chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine, and declared that the many sanctions leveled at Russia amounted to a declaration of war. The very fact that a major nuclear power openly attacked a peaceful neighbor would have roiled the international scene, but the attack was compounded by two significant questions. One, would Russia soon attack any or all NATO nations that were, until the early 1990s, Soviet satellite states? Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, all of whom are now in NATO. Had Russia now permanently rejected the major tenets of the international system, which held that member states would not change borders by force of arms? No one can say what Putin's plans are, but it's clear from his actions that he is intent on burying the second of those two tenets. Canada has been a NATO member since signing the Treaty of Washington in the summer of 1949. Indeed, Canada, the US, and Great Britain began to discuss a North Atlantic alliance as early as January 1948. At one time, Canada made land, sea, and air contributions to NATO that were at least appropriate for a country of Canada's size, economy, and strategic challenges. Canada also began forging ties with the United States for the defense of North America in August 1940 that are the foundation of thousands of different defense agreements and arrangements between Canada and the United States, including the North American Aerospace Defense Command and the North Warning System designed to locate air and space threats in the skies of North America. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, several NATO nations began to send weapons, such as man-fired anti-tank and anti-aircraft rockets, into Ukraine. The main suppliers were the United States and Britain. Canada sent some lethal equipment, but part of the allotment was obsolete, decades-old Carl Gustav anti-tank weapons. The United States sent thousands of troops to shore up the defense of Europe, especially to the Baltic states, and reiterated to Putin that it stood ready to enforce Article 5 of the NATO agreement. An attack against one NATO nation is an attack against all NATO nations. Several NATO nations indicated that defense spending would increase. Germany canceled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, announced a program of energy diversification to wean them off of Russian gas, and added some 30% to its defense budget in 1 year. The Cold War is back, with the distinct possibility that President Putin will make a grab for NATO territory, particularly in the Baltic. He has already started to militarize the Arctic Ocean and turn it into a Russian littoral. The sudden shift in global geopolitics now taking place is somewhat akin to the shock of the North Korean attack against South Korea in 1950. There, on June 25, 1950, North Korean military forces, equipped largely by the USSR, attacked South Korea in an effort to unite the Korean peninsula under Soviet control. When a UN counterattack threw the North Koreans back in the fall, China intervened in the war in November 1950, only to be pushed back to the original ceasefire line near the 38th parallel by mid-1951. The North Korean attack was seen in NATO capitals as a test of the then one-year-old alliance. If the communists succeeded in Korea, Russia might try something similar in Central Europe. The US, Britain, and Canada began an immediate increase in defense spending. Canadians were as caught by surprise as anyone. Just 5 years after the greatest military effort in Canadian history, war suddenly loomed again for the people of Canada. Canadians were in the midst of a post-war boom. Returning veterans were building families. They were buying homes in new subdivisions, purchasing new cars for the first time since the start of the Second World War, and beginning to enjoy a peaceful, prosperous life. Suddenly, war. And the prospect of a much wider war, unless NATO armed itself to the teeth and confronted the Red Menace all along the Iron Curtain in Europe. The key word on everyone's mind was deterrence, and Canada had to play its part, not only because Washington and London insisted that Canada share the burden, but because a large majority of Canadians from coast to coast pressed the government to become involved. By August 1950, Canada had committed an army brigade to fight in Korea, dispatched 3 destroyers to Korean waters to patrol the coasts under American and British command, and detailed a transport squadron to fly supplies to Japan for shipment to Korea from the West Coast. By early 1951, Canadian troops joined the fight at the front in Korea. Eventually, over 25,000 Canadians served there, and more than 500 Canadians lost their lives. The Canadian defense budget ballooned from around $6 billion in 1950-1951 to $13.5 billion by 1954-55. In other words, it doubled in 4 years. To avoid rapid inflation, taxes were raised and programs were cut to accommodate the increase in military spending. So, at a surprise, defense became a #1 priority. The total number of personnel in the Canadian military went from under 50,000 in 1948 to over 150,000 by 1955 in a nation of only 15.6 million people. It was a sizable expenditure. More than 40% of the Canadian budget went to defense. Canada's defenses today are not as pitiful as they were in 1950, but they are as inadequate as they have been for many years. In 1960, defense accounted for over 4% of Canada's GDP. Today, the figure is 1.39%. If Canada were to double its current defense expenditures in 4 years, as it did after the outbreak of the Korean War, the defense budget would increase from its current 28.7 billion to 45 billion or so in 4 years. Why is this necessary? Because the current state of the military is deplorable. Canada has no modern fighter aircraft and has yet to choose between the Swedish Saab Gripen and the American Lockheed Martin F-35. The Halifax-class patrol frigates are approaching 30 years old. The Royal Canadian Navy has no military auxiliary support ships, though it has one civilian ship leased to the Navy and a second is proposed, neither of which will be able to enter a conflict zone. Canada currently possesses 4 diesel-electric submarines built in British shipyards near the end of the Cold War, which can barely soar T3 at any one time, and none have under ice capability. The full-time military is 5,000 personnel short of establishment of almost 12%. The Army has no anti-aircraft capability and only obsolete anti-tank weapons. It will take hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade the North Warning System, and the government has not allocated any funds for that purpose. And the beat goes on. Canada is as unready to face the challenge of Cold War 2.0, either as a NATO partner or as a partner with the United States in defending the continent or in defending the Arctic, as it has ever been. Our Arctic coast lies naked to Russian aggression. Our Arctic sea lanes are vulnerable to Russia's ice-breaking capability and under-ice ballistic missile submarines. We can do almost nothing to help our NATO allies or play an appropriate role in defending North America. The several hundred additional troops we have sent to Latvia is quite frankly a joke. It is time for a massive increase in our defense budget, paid for with higher taxes, and a deferment of promises made by this government to spend on childcare, pharmacare, and a host of other programs that can now be taken up only after our defenses are at least adequate. There is no time to waste, and we must start now. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions if there are.
I don't see any questions, so I will just move on to my own closing remarks here. So thank you, Dr. Bercuson, for that. It was very interesting and timely closing remarks there. And I believe everyone, especially from a Canadian perspective, appreciates your insights there. So with that being said, I am happy to bring the 21st Annual Graduate Strategic Studies Conference to a close now. It has truly been an honor for all of us on the S3C team to have you all here today and yesterday to participate in the conference and build upon the now 21-year-old tradition at the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies. The success, however, of this conference would not be possible alone or without the help of various individuals and organizations. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my team that helped at various points to make this conference possible, with Jordan helping out with the financial side, Davina helping out making the lovely conference program that we have, and Granite, who contributed his ideas, thoughts, and even introduced yesterday's keynote speaker. So thank you to all of them. I would also like to take a moment to thank Megan Martins-DePonte and Alexander McDonald, former CMSS alum in the case of Alex, current in the case of Megan, who both restarted this conference last year after a couple years in hiatus. Similar thanks is also owed to Tim Choi, who at various points answered our questions and concerns for how to run things and the like. So a big thank you to him as well. I would also like to thank the CMSS's current director, Dr. Aaron Gizman-Brunshot, and CMSS's coordinator, Mary Kathleen Anderson, for their help and support throughout this whole process. And lastly, I would like to thank all of our sponsors who contributed in various ways to make this event possible. In particular, I'd like to give a shout out to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, who helped us secure Lieutenant General Bose as a speaker for today's keynote, and the Canadian International Council's Young Professionals Network, as well as the North American Arctic Defense and Security Network for their help in promoting the event on various social media outlets. And lastly, but certainly not least, I would also like to thank the conference participants whose submissions and subsequently their presentations formed the backbone of our conference. It was really an honor to have you all come here present your research, and on behalf of the S3C team, I would like to thank you for all the time and effort you exerted to participate today. With that being said, thank you for making this conference a success, and we look forward to seeing you next year to host the 22nd Annual Graduate Strategic Studies Conference. So with that said, we will adjourn for the day, and yeah, thank you all for coming out.